Sometimes it's helpful when we're comparing and contrasting to start off with what's in common between two things. In this case, a standard switch and a distributed switch. So I'd like to take a moment and we'll do some chalkboard work to take a look at some of the common features that are found in both flavors of switches. And then we'll continue the discussion by looking at the enhanced features that are only available on a distributed switch. And for this comparison, let's draw a standard switch over here. Now, standard switch is the one that comes built into ESXi, and the distributed switch is the one that we're going to get from the Enterprise Plus license of vSphere. So this is our vSphere standard switch, and this is our vSphere distributed switch. So on both of these, we are going to have ports and port groups. And that's where our VMs connect. So each ESXi host has its own standard switch. And so if we want to modify or work with the port group, we'd have to do that on a ESXi host by ESXi host by ESXi host basis, where if we're using a distributed switch and all of our ESXi hosts were using it, we could go ahead and manipulate or modify port group information, and that would, boom, be applied across the board to all the ESXi hosts that are using this distributed switch. But the concepts of port groups are similar. That's where virtual machines and VM kernel adapters logically connect to the switch. And regarding uplinks, we have similar options. So let's start off by taking a look at some of the features that are applicable to both flavors of switches. One is security, referring to the security section regarding the switch. Now, on a standard switch, the security policy is applied to the switch as a whole. And in a distributed switch, we'd apply that to a port group. But very similar features exist for security. And that would be things like, are you going to allow promiscuous mode, yes or no, on a port? Or do you want to allow the virtual machine to change its MAC address and recognize that new MAC address, yes or no? And do you want to allow a virtual machine to send frames into the switch which are not its own, meaning the source MAC address isn't the MAC address that the device is using? So those same options exist for a standard switch or for an individual port group. And what we'll discover is that the default behavior for those three options are slightly different on a standard switch versus a distributed switch, which I'll demonstrate here in an upcoming video. But as far as the options, they exist on both. Another option that is similar on both is traffic shaping. On a standard switch, we'd apply that to the switch as a whole, and in a distributed switch, we could apply that to a specific port group. And for traffic shaping on a standard switch, it is outbound only. We can only implement outbound traffic shaping, where on a distributed switch, we can do outbound traffic shaping as traffic is leaving a port on the distributed switch. We can also do traffic shaping for traffic coming in from the VM to that port. So that's a slight difference, but they both support some flavor of traffic shaping. Another concept that both types of switches support is the concept of network teaming and failover, where we can identify if we have multiple links, how they're going to work together to connect the virtual switch to the outside world. Now, one additional aspect of that on the distributed switch with teaming is we can actually base that based on load. So both switches have the ability to do it based on a hash or IP information or the source port, the source logical port the VM is coming in on. But the distributed switch also adds the option, if we want to choose it, of using load based. So it can sample which ones are the most used. And then based on the load, the actual load on those links, decide which link it's going to use to forward a VM's traffic. And to help prepare you for the lab, I want to share with you the interface for configuring those same aspects on a standard switch versus a distributed switch. So here I am in the lab environment. I'm going to go ahead and double click here on the vSphere client. And just as a heads up, if you've just loaded the lab, sometimes it takes a minute or two after the lab is initialized for vCenter in the background to fully be ready. So if you open up that link for the vSphere client and you get a 404 or some other message, just give it a little bit more time to fully initialize, and then you should be good to go. So I'm going to log in as administrator at vSphere.local. I'll supply the password, and away we go. And looks like I have a little warning here on ESXi1. Let me see what that's all about. And click on summary. All right. So basically on the lab rebooting, there's a host and power state warning or alert. So we'll go ahead and click on reset to green and verify that ESXi1 is present. Great, great, great. All right, so in a previous set of videos, we configured distributed switching, and we created a distributed switch called VMs and a distributed switch called management. So to look at those three categories of options that we just mentioned on the chalkboard, let's go to the host and clusters view. Let's go to switch 1, and under configure virtual switches, I don't have a standard switch anymore, but you know what? We can create one. We'll just go ahead right here under configure networking and click on add networking. All right, and I'm just going to click the middle button here, click on next, And I'm going to make a new standard switch so we can see the defaults. Click on Next. And I'm going to assign an adapter. Now, VM NIC 6, we're going to use that later for something else. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to associate that uplink VM NIC 6 with this new virtual switch so it has connectivity to the outside world. And click on OK. And then click on Next. And I will call this demo port group on ESXi 1, because a standard switch and its associated port groups exist individually on each ESXi host. We could specify the VLAN assignment for everybody who's connecting to this standard switch. We'll take a closer look at VLANs as we continue through these videos, but for right now, we'll click on Next and Finish, and survey says, there it is. There's our standard switch. So if we wanted to modify the properties of this standard switch, the one we just created, which is vSwitch 0, we just simply click on Edit right here. And here are the 3 basic options for policies for this standard switch. Under Security, these are the defaults for a standard switch. Reject promiscuous mode, so that all the switch ports act like real layer 2 switch ports and don't forward all traffic to all ports. The MAC address changes. The MAC address change says it allows the virtual machine to change its layer 2 address, and it'll accept that. And forge transmits allows the VM who's hanging off of a switch port to go ahead and send layer 2 frames into the network where the source layer 2 address isn't the layer 2 address that the VM is using. So there are cases that you might want to allow those. So reject, accept are the defaults for a standard switch. What we'll see in the distributed switch is that the defaults are reject, 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 just taking a more secure posture to start with. Then for traffic shaping, this is on the standard switch. It allows for traffic shaping if we want to, but it's only going to be for outbound traffic, meaning outbound from the port on the switch going to the VM. So we can, if we enable it, we can specify how we want to throttle that traffic back. I'm not going to enable it for this virtual switch, but that's how we would do it. And then for teaming and failover, we have the options for how do you want to do the load balancing based on IP hash or source MAC hash, or just based on the source port that the virtual machine is coming from. And that's referring to the logical port on the virtual switch, like port 0, port 1, port 2, and so forth. And if we have multiple adapters, we can also specify an explicit failover order. So all of these options exist on the distributed switch as well, except we also have an additional feature that says, do you want to do routing based on load, on which of your uplinks, if you have multiple uplinks, which one is least busy, and then it can go ahead and do its load balancing decisions based on near real-time load. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that as its default. And these features, these policy features for security, traffic shaping, and teaming, those are all done at the switch level. So I'll click on OK. And now let's compare those 3 features on the distributed switch, which are going to be configured on the distributed switch's port group. So here is the DSVMs. That's a distributed switch, and we'll go down to our distributed switch port group that we created in our previous set of videos, and we'll simply, from here, right-click and click on Edit Settings. Another way of doing this would be to click this here, and then click on Configure, and then click on Edit here. Either way, it's going to get us to the configuration for the port group, the distributed port group, on this distributed switch. So we'll click on Edit, and if you'll notice, here's the same 3 options. For security, we have promiscuous mode, MAC address changes, forge transmits. It's reject by default on all 3. For traffic shaping, it's very similar, except it now has inbound to the switch and outbound from the switch traffic shaping capabilities. And then for teaming and failover, very similar, except on the distributed switch, we have this additional option here, which was not present on the standard switch, and that is route based on physical network interface card load. And that would be the VM NICs, the uplinks that are being used. And hopefully you have at least a couple, otherwise it won't matter too much about load balancing if you only have one uplink in use. So those 3 elements are similar: security, traffic shaping, and teaming and failover. And as far as what's additional in the distributed switch, here are a few examples. If we click on Advanced right here, we have the option, besides just setting up the policy for the distributed port group, we also have the ability at a port by port by port level to allow configuration of that port to have its own specific overriding configuration. So if we want to allow individual port configuration to have their specific settings, we can simply click on Allow here, and that gives us the option on a port by port level to set these same features. So by default, everything is disabled as far as override at the port level, except for the blocking. So I will leave those at their defaults. And if we click on VLAN, And VLAN compared to a standard switch, on a standard switch, when we create the switch itself, it allows us to associate a specific VLAN for everybody who's connecting to that standard switch. Here, with a distributed switch, we can say VLAN, which does effectively the same thing, but for this port group. So we can specify VLAN 10, and then anybody connecting to this port group would be associated with VLAN 10. And then as traffic goes to the outside world via the uplinks, assuming we're also allowing trunking there, it would also be tagged going out to the physical world with an 802.1q trunk tag of VLAN 10. However, it doesn't end there for options. For VLAN, we can also do VLAN trunking. And what that means is we could become a trunk to a virtual machine. So if this is the virtual switch right here, and here is our port group that we're configuring, and we're allowing trunking, actually we could put a switch here, and as traffic goes over this port out to the virtual machine, in this case it's acting as a switch, it can send traffic for all of its VLANs that need to be forwarded over this trunk, and it will tag them once again with an 802.1q. That's the tagging that's the protocol used for tagging for identifying a VLAN as a frame is being sent over a trunk. So there's not a whole lot of use cases for that, but if you had a virtual machine or something that needed to receive those 802.1q tags and have visibility to all the VLANs on this switch, that would be our option for doing it, is with VLAN trunking. And then the other option here is private VLANs, which we will have a separate video just on setting up and enabling private VLANs. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back to none, so there's no tagging involved. And then for monitoring, we have the option of using NetFlow. And here's how NetFlow is extremely helpful. Let's say we have a question that maybe our boss asks us, hey, what percentage of our traffic is DNS? And what percentage of our traffic is remote desktop? And what percentage of our traffic is XYZ? and the administrator might look at the manager and say, I have no idea, because we don't have visibility into that. Well, NetFlow can give us visibility into that. Here's how it works. Let's say we have a router, and that's connected to a switch. And let's say we have lots of clients, and then that router has connections to other networks beyond. What we could do is we could enable NetFlow on either like a VLAN or on a port, and we could basically collect stats on what is happening as far as traffic going through that port. And as that information is collected, it's not doing a full packet capture, but it's kind of like a Reader's Digest version of what's going on. So it could say, oh, we had 2,000 DNS packets, and our top talkers were between IP address A and IP address B, and 30% of our traffic is HTTP. Just information at a fairly high level regarding that. So what we'd do is we would either collect information looking at that port or at the whole switch, all the VLAN traffic, and we would ship it over to something called a collector. And we'd be using the NetFlow protocol to do that. And NetFlow was initially created by Cisco, and it's been standardized now. So this guy collects information about the traffic types, sends it to the collector, and then you and we can sit at a management station that has software that can analyze that data and just have a really good dashboard of what type of traffic is going over our network. For example, how much traffic is going between VMs on an ESXi host, or how much traffic is going from our VMs to the outside world, and what types of traffic, and so forth. So that's what NetFlow is all about. So we would enable it here for the port group, and then at the distributed switch, we would actually go in to configure the details regarding where the collector is, what port we want to use, how much of the traffic do we want to sample, and so forth. I'll show you that as well in a separate video. And then under miscellaneous, we have the option of blocking all ports. Now this is pretty cool, because let's imagine that we had this distributed switch and this port group specifically that was being used by dozens and dozens of ESXi hosts. And we had a distributed switch for some type of server, and we realized, oh my gosh, there's some malware or there's something terrible happening to all those servers. I want to shut down all the ports on this distributed port group right now. What we could do is just flip that to yes, click on OK, which I won't do at the moment, and anybody that's using this distributed port group, their traffic is going to be stopped right at that moment. So it's pretty powerful in an emergency, and that's really the only time I can see using it, is if you had some type of emergency like that. And while we're here, let me also just touch on a few additional features that we'll go into more detail as we go through these videos. One would be Ether channel. So let's imagine this is our vSphere distributed switch, and on the outside physical world, we have a physical switch. And let's imagine we have a few uplinks. So from a vSphere perspective, those would be the VM NICs that are connecting over here to our physical switch. What we have the option of doing is we can take those 4 physical links and logically make them look like one, a link aggregation group. And the open standard protocol to help negotiate that is called Link Aggregation Control Protocol. And that feature of link aggregation with what Cisco calls Ether channel, but link aggregation with Link Aggregation Control Protocol is supported if we have the vSphere distributed switch. Another great option is port mirroring. So let's imagine we have our distributed switch and we've got some port groups. Then we have VMs that are logically connected to those switch ports, which are in those port groups. Well, if we have a management station that's off of this port right here, what we could do is we could go ahead and say for port mirroring, I want to take all the traffic from here, here, and this guy, and I want to replicate that and send it over to this port. And that way on this device, we could have a tool, like a packet capturing tool, that would then, when it receives all that information, could analyze it and work with it. So it's just replicating or copying all the traffic from those ports with port mirroring up to a port where we would want to go ahead and analyze that traffic. And one other feature, and then I'll stop this video because I can go on forever. One other feature is Link Layer Discovery Protocol. And Cisco has an option of CDP, and let's talk about both of those for a moment. In networking, it's pretty tough if you're not right there with the physical gear, and most of the time we aren't anymore, to determine who the next door neighbor is. So if we have, let me clear off my screen here. So if we have an uplink, for example, that's going to a device, maybe it's a Cisco router or Cisco switch or some other vendor, it'd be great if we could tell who we're connected to just based on some magic. And that magic would come in the form of Link Layer Discovery Protocol. So periodically, if we have enabled Link Layer Discovery Protocol, they send little messages back and forth so we can see, oh, I'm connected to this router. His name is R1. Here's his capabilities and so forth. And here's his primary IP address, etc. So if it's a Cisco device, it can support CDP. However, if it's not a Cisco device, the open standard for that little discovery protocol is Link Layer Discovery Protocol. And that's one of the features of a distributed switch, is that it has the ability to support LLDP, assuming you have the right hardware, and that way it can discover adjacent devices like routers and switches and other networking devices if they also support and are running Link Layer Discovery Protocol, which is pretty handy. That way you can know, oh, off this port, I'm connected to router 1, or off of this port, more likely, I'm connected to switch 1, because these are layer 2 uplinks, and normally what we're going to be doing is connecting to a layer 2 port using layer 2 at this connection point right here between the two switches. And also on the uplinks, and this is true for a standard switch as well as a distributed switch, if we placed VMs as part of a VLAN, like VLAN 10, as that traffic goes out to the physical world, the tagging can happen right here. So if traffic from this port group, which is VLAN 10, and this port group is VLAN 20, they'll get the respective tags as they go out to the physical world. And as a result, the physical switches will know how to forward those frames appropriately based on which VLANs they're associated with. So on a standard switch, it's the entire switch, like VLAN 10, that's it. And with a distributed switch, we can assign individual VLAN membership on a distributed port group by distributed port group basis. All right, so it went a little bit longer than I was planning, but I wanted to share with you some of the features and the added features that a distributed switch brings to the table. And in the next video, let's pick maybe a handful of those features, and I'll walk you through the configuration and verification of those features in a distributed switch. So we'll do that in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to